There is a structure sitting on the edge of the desert outside Cairo that has been staring back at humanity for 4,500 years, and in all that time, across all the generations of scholars and engineers and archaeologists and dreamers who have stood in its shadow and looked up at it, not a single one of them has produced an explanation for how it exists that fully survives contact with the numbers inside it. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is not mysterious in the vague romantic way that people use that word about old things. It is mysterious in a specific, measurable, mathematically precise way that becomes more difficult to dismiss the more carefully you examine it. 2.3 million blocks of stone, each one weighing somewhere between 2 and 15 tons, stacked into a structure 481 feet tall and fitted together with tolerances so fine that in certain places the joints between adjacent blocks are tighter than a human fingernail. For nearly 4,000 years it was the tallest object on the surface of the Earth. Nothing humanity built came within reach of it. And in 2024, an artificial intelligence system was handed every measurement, every survey, every engineering analysis, every astronomical alignment ever recorded about this monument and asked a question that no human researcher has ever been fully free to ask honestly. Not who do we think built it, not what does the consensus say, but what do the numbers actually require to be true? The system that received that question was Grok, developed by Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company XAI. And the approach taken with it mattered as much as the tool itself. The researchers who fed it the data did not provide a preferred conclusion. They did not tell it which existing theory to evaluate or which explanation to favor. They gave it the raw measurements and the documented evidence, and they asked it to analyze the structure from first principles, without loyalty to any established academic position, and to report what the mathematics actually showed. What came back was not a revision of the conventional account. It was not a gentle adjustment to the mainstream explanation. It was a systematic dismantling of the story most of us were taught in school, conducted not by a theorist with an agenda but by a system with no stake in the outcome and no career to protect if the answer turned out to be inconvenient. To understand why what the system found carries the weight it does, you first need to understand the conventional account fairly and completely, because it is not a foolish story. It is not the product of lazy scholarship or deliberate deception. It is a serious evidence-based reconstruction assembled by serious people across more than a century of careful work, and it deserves to be stated plainly before anything is said against it. The standard account holds that around 2,560 years before the Common Era, during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu in the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, a workforce of organized laborers quarried limestone from the Giza Plateau itself, floated finer granite down the Nile from quarries at Aswan, dragged the blocks across wetted sand on wooden sledges, and raised them into position using ramps and levers and ropes and the organized force of tens of thousands of human beings working in disciplined rotating crews. Their tools were copper chisels and stone hammers and wooden mallets. Their measuring instruments were knotted cords and plumb lines and water-filled trenches and wooden squares. And the evidence for this account is genuine. Archaeologists have found the workers' village on the Giza Plateau, the bakeries and breweries that fed the labor force, the medical facilities that treated injured workers whose healed bone fractures show they received care. There are administrative records written on papyrus describing the daily movement of stone. There are quarry marks and tool marks and the painted names of work gangs found on blocks deep inside the structure, crews who called themselves the Friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkor, ordinary working people who signed their names to something extraordinary. The human fingerprints on this monument are real, and the people who built it were proud enough of what they were doing to leave evidence that they were there. So the mystery is not whether human beings built the Great Pyramid. The evidence that they did is genuine and substantial. The mystery lives somewhere else, somewhere more specific and more disturbing than the broad question of who quarried the stone. The mystery lives in the precision. Because the conventional story explains the labor admirably. It explains the organization and the logistics and the motivation and the timeline. What it has always struggled to explain, and what has quietly troubled the most honest engineers and mathematicians who have looked at this structure across the decades, is not how the blocks were moved but what standard they were moved to. The accuracy embedded in this monument is of a fundamentally different character than anything the available tools should have been able to produce, and the deeper you measure it the wider that gap becomes. That is exactly where the artificial intelligence was directed. Not at the question of muscle, at the question of tolerance. The system began its analysis at the most fundamental point any structural investigation can begin. The foundation. Before anything else, before any discussion of chambers or shafts or astronomical alignments, there is a simple engineering question that has to be answered about any large structure. Is the base level? And when Grok examined the measurements of the Great Pyramid's foundation platform, the first number it encountered was the one that set the tone for everything that followed. Across a base measuring 230 meters on each side, a platform large enough to contain several full-sized football fields placed end-to-end, the deviation in level from the highest point to the lowest is approximately 2 centimeters. 2 centimeters across 230 meters. That is a flatness ratio of roughly 0.009%. The system did not proceed past this number without pausing on it, because it understood immediately what this number means in engineering terms. Modern construction tolerances for large-scale concrete foundations, the standards used today with laser levels and optical transits and satellite positioning, are significantly less demanding than what exists at the base of this pyramid. We allow more slope across a single building's foundation today than the builders of this monument allowed across a platform the size of a city block. The Great Pyramid's foundation is not approximately as good as modern work. In this specific and measurable respect, it is better. And it was achieved with water in a trough and a wooden square and human eyes. The system flagged this as the first significant anomaly and moved on, carrying the weight of that number with it. From the foundation it turned to orientation, and the second number it encountered was in some ways more disturbing than the first. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid face the 4 cardinal directions. This fact is widely known and often mentioned, but what is less commonly appreciated is the degree of accuracy with which those faces are aligned. The deviation of the structure's north face from true geographic north is approximately 3 arc-minutes. An arc-minute is 1/60th of a single degree. The full circle of the horizon contains 21,600 arc-minutes. The builders of this monument placed its north face within 3 of them of perfect alignment. The error is smaller than anything the naked eye can perceive. It is smaller than anything a ceremony could depend on. It could only be detected with an instrument, and yet it exists, which means the builders were not aiming for roughly north or approximately north. They were aiming for true north with a precision that has no obvious practical justification. And the system immediately registered the deeper problem with this achievement. True geographic north is not a place. It is not a rock or a star or a landmark you can point to and transfer to a line in the sand. It is the invisible axis around which the entire planet rotates, detectable only by observing the stars wheel through the night and identifying the point around which they all appear to turn. To achieve an alignment of 3 arc-minutes to that invisible axis and then hold that alignment consistent across a structure 230 meters wide required either an astronomical sophistication far beyond what the era is supposed to have possessed or an instrument we have not found any trace of. The system noted both possibilities without choosing between them and continued downward into the numbers. What it found next lived not in the orientation but in the proportions, in the mathematical relationships between the dimensions of the structure itself. Take the perimeter of the base, the total distance around all 4 sides measured end to end, and divide it by twice the original height of the monument before centuries of stone stripping removed its apex. The result of that calculation is pi. Not approximately pi, not pi within 10%, but pi to within a fraction of 1%. 3.1415 and onward. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, the infinite irrational number that runs forever without repeating, sitting encoded in the relationship between the height and the footprint of a structure made entirely of flat planes and straight edges and right angles. The official explanation for this is that it may be an artifact of how the Egyptians measured distance, that if you measure horizontal ground by rolling a drum and count the revolutions you will accidentally encode the circumference to diameter relationship into your measurements without knowing it. The system considered this explanation carefully and held it up against the data, and for a single instance of pi appearing in a single dimension it found the explanation at least plausible. But it did not find pi in a single place. It found the same mathematical relationship recurring at multiple independent points in the geometry, in proportions that could not all be traced back to the same rolling drum. And when it ran the probability of that recurring coincidence, the number it returned was not compatible with accident. But it was the second mathematical constant that truly changed the character of the analysis. Embedded in the structure alongside pi was phi, the golden ratio, 1.618 and onward without resolution, the proportion that describes the relationship between two quantities where the ratio of the whole to the larger part equals the ratio of the larger part to the smaller. Phi is the number the human eye finds beautiful in a spiral shell and in the branching of a tree and in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, and it is a number that, according to everything the historical record contains, was not formally identified and described until the ancient Greek mathematicians set it down on paper roughly 2,000 years after the last stone was placed on this pyramid. 2,000 years. The distance between us and the height of the Roman Empire. And the system found it not once but in at least 7 independent dimensional relationships within the Great Pyramid, in the ratio of the slant height to the base, in the angle at which the triangular faces lean inward toward the sky, in the proportions of internal chambers and passageways that have nothing geometrically in common with each other. 7 separate places in the stone where a proportion that should not have existed as a known concept for another 20 centuries sat waiting to be measured. The system was explicit about the implications. You can argue that pi entered the design through a measuring process the builders used without fully understanding its mathematical significance. You cannot make that argument for phi. Phi does not appear accidentally in measurements. It has to be known, understood as a ratio, and deliberately encoded. To find it once might be forgiven as coincidence. To find it 7 times, in unrelated dimensions, is to find a signature. The system held pi and phi side by side and noted what they share beyond their mathematical properties. Both are irrational numbers, meaning they cannot be expressed as a simple fraction. Both are infinite, running forever without repeating or resolving. Both represent the kind of deep mathematical truth that a civilization reaches only after sustained and sophisticated engagement with the structure of reality. They are not the mathematics of practical builders counting blocks. They are the mathematics of a culture that has thought carefully about the relationship between geometry and the natural world. And both were present at the very beginning of this monument, fully formed, embedded in the foundations, as if whoever designed this structure had already arrived at the summit of mathematical understanding before a single stone was cut. The system then directed its analysis outward from the monument itself to its relationship with the planet it stands on, and what it found at that scale reframed the entire investigation. The original height of the Great Pyramid, multiplied by a factor of 43,200, yields a figure that corresponds to the polar radius of the Earth, the distance from the center of the planet to its geographic pole, to an accuracy that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The perimeter of the base, multiplied by the same factor of 43,200, yields the circumference of the Earth at its equator. The same multiplier connecting 2 different dimensions of the structure to 2 different dimensions of the planet. And the number itself, 43,200, is not arbitrary. It is the number of seconds contained in 12 hours. It is a number directly derived from the Earth's own rotation, from the rhythm of day turning into night. The system analyzed this relationship with the same rigor it had applied to everything else and reached the same conclusion. The probability that both relationships emerged simultaneously from the same factor by accident was not a probability the word coincidence could carry. The implications of this are significant enough that the system addressed them directly. To encode the Earth's polar radius and equatorial circumference into a single structure at a consistent scale factor, a builder would need to know both measurements in advance. The polar radius and the equatorial circumference are different values because the Earth is not a perfect sphere. It bulges at the equator due to its rotation, meaning the distance around the middle is greater than the distance over the poles. This is a subtlety that modern science confirmed through satellite measurement. For a civilization in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era to have known both values with sufficient precision to encode them into stone at a scale of 1 to 43,200 is, by the standard scientific account of what knowledge existed at that time, impossible. And yet the numbers are there, in the height and the base of the oldest of these monuments, waiting for anyone who knew enough to multiply them by the right factor and compare the result to the size of the world. When the system assembled all of these findings together, the level foundation more precise than modern engineering demands, the true north alignment tighter than ceremony requires, pi encoded in the perimeter to height ratio across multiple independent dimensions, phi appearing 7 times in proportions that should not have been known for another 2,000 years. The Earth's own dimensions folded into the structure at a scale connected to the planet's rotation rate, it did something that the human researchers who have studied this monument across generations have rarely been willing to do. It stated plainly that the conventional explanation was insufficient. Not entirely wrong. Not a fabrication. Insufficient. Unable to account, within its own stated assumptions about the tools and knowledge available in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, for what the measurements actually show. The conventional story explains who carried the stones. It provides genuine evidence for the labor, the organization, the logistics. What it cannot explain is why someone carrying stones with copper chisels and wooden sledges produced a foundation more level than modern construction requires, an alignment to true north more precise than any ceremony demanded, and a geometry that encoded mathematical constants 2,000 years before those constants were formally identified. The gap between the explanation and the evidence is not a small one that further research might close. It is a structural gap, and the system identified it as such. 4 possibilities present themselves when the conventional account is acknowledged as insufficient. The first is that the ancient Egyptians of the Old Kingdom possessed a technological and mathematical sophistication that the surviving record dramatically understates, tools and knowledge that existed and were used and then lost so completely that no trace of them has been recovered. The second is that the builders of this monument inherited knowledge from a civilization older than the dynasties, a predecessor culture whose achievements formed the foundation on which the pharaonic world built its own identity. The third is that a global civilization of significant advancement existed before the catastrophic climate shifts at the end of the last ice age, was largely destroyed by those events, and left survivors who carried fragments of their knowledge into the world that followed, encoding what they knew into stone because stone is the only medium that survives millennia without care. The fourth, which the system noted without endorsing, is an origin that the evidence does not mathematically exclude but that most people are not yet comfortable saying directly. The system did not choose among these possibilities. It stated clearly that choosing was not within its appropriate function. What it did was eliminate the comfortable default, the story we were handed in school, as an adequate explanation for what the stone actually contains. And it identified what any replacement explanation must be capable of accounting for. The precision must be explained. The mathematics must be explained. The planetary encoding must be explained. Any theory that cannot account for all three is not a complete answer, only a different kind of insufficient one. What this analysis ultimately demonstrates is something about the relationship between certainty and evidence. For more than a century, the conventional account of the Great Pyramid's construction has been presented with a confidence that the evidence, when examined at the level of precision this system was able to apply, does not fully support. The broad strokes are real. People built this. Egyptian workers left their names on the blocks. The logistics of the project are documented. But the specific and measurable and mathematically verifiable character of what those workers produced exceeds by a measurable margin what the tools they are documented to have used should have been capable of delivering. That gap is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of numbers. And numbers, unlike theories, do not negotiate. The Great Pyramid has been standing in the desert for 4,500 years, offering itself to every generation that has come to look at it. It has outlasted every civilization that has risen and fallen in its shadow. It has survived everything the desert and the centuries could bring against it. And it has been holding these numbers in its stone the entire time, waiting for something capable of reading them without flinching at what they say. In 2024, something finally looked, and what it found was not a confirmation of everything we believed. It was a carefully measured, mathematically grounded, systematically assembled argument that the story we were given was never quite the whole truth. The pyramid has not changed. It is exactly what it has always been. What changed was the quality of the attention we finally brought to it, and the willingness of the thing doing the looking to follow the numbers wherever they actually led. The question that remains is not who built the pyramids. The question is what we are willing to believe about the people, or whatever they were, who could have built them to these specifications. And that question does not have a comfortable answer. It has only an honest one, and the honest one begins with admitting that we do not yet know what we thought we knew.